Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabriele Magni. I'm the director of the Global Policy Institute at Loyola Marymount University. And today I'm thrilled to welcome you to a very timely conversation on progressive capitalism, inequality, and opportunity. We are very lucky to have an incredible guest with us today, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor Stiglitz received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001. Before that, he received the John Bates Clark Medal. And during his career, Professor Stiglitz has made a hugely influential contribution to the discipline. Known for his pioneering work on asymmetric information, Stiglitz's work has also focused on income distribution, risk, corporate governance, public policy, macroeconomics, and globalization. He's also been very active in the policy world. Professor Stiglitz is a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank, and is a former chairman of the US President's Council of Economic Advisors. Professor Stiglitz has received more than 40 honorary degrees, including degrees from Cambridge and Harvard University. He was named several times by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Today, Professor Stiglitz is university professor at Columbia University, and he actively contributes to policy discussions that are really central to our times, including discussions on economic justice, the transition to a green economy, and student debt. Welcome, Professor Stiglitz, and thank you so much for being with us today. We are also very lucky to have another great speaker today, Dr. Prachi Jain. Dr. Jain is assistant professor of economics at Loyola Marymount University. She received a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Then she went on to receive a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan and completed a postdoctoral research fellowship at Princeton University. Dr. Jain's research studies how low-income individuals manage in the face of poverty, studies behavioral factors that perpetuate the impact of poverty, and gender gaps and discrimination in the labor market. Professor Jain, thank you so much for being with us today. One last point before we start. There will be time for questions from the audience in the second part of the event. And so if you're following and if you have a question, please submit the question through the Q&A feature so that we can then answer your question. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us today, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz, for being here. As an economist, it's hard to understate your impact on our profession. As I teach undergrads, it's sometimes remarkable how much conversations around capitalism and equality have changed, even in the course of my own career. My understanding is you grew up in a steel mill town of Gary, Indiana in the 1950s. How do you think that period of your life affected your own views on capitalism and its impact on inequality?
Well, that was sometimes said the golden age of capitalism. But it was in many ways a very different kind of capitalism. It was an area where sometimes described as managerial capitalism, where you have big companies like US Steel run by managers, not individuals. US Steel had been started by Carnegie, but he had long gone, and it was a sort of corporate governance. But in that period that is often described as the golden age of capitalism, it wasn't so golden, at least not as I saw it in Gary, Indiana. There was an enormous amount of inequality. Just, as a young person growing up, you could see it. A lot of racial discrimination. And I later learned when I came to study economics that doesn't exist in well-functioning markets, but the world was so different from what we were taught. I saw it with my own eyes, and you just couldn't ignore it. And in contrast to the sort of nirvana that economists often use to describe how well competitive markets work, there was a lot of labor strife, a lot of unemployment. When there was a strike, when the economy went down, my classmates didn't have any money. Life was really, really hard for a lot of people. So you could see that while, quote, there was prosperity, it wasn't a shared prosperity. But there was a particular view of economics at the time that changed dramatically beginning around the 1970s, about 15, 20 years after I growing up. And it was a change influenced by sometimes called the Chicago economist, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, a whole group of Gary Becker, a whole group of economists who preached the idea that markets worked beautifully if only you let them work. Mm-hmm. And Milton Friedman pushed the idea that corporations should only work for their shareholders, and that it was a sin if the manager ever took account of the community in which he lived, the environment, other than obeying the minimum that the law set. And so we went through 40 years of what is sometimes called neoliberal capitalism. And I would say it hasn't worked out very well. That it was supposed to deliver more growth, and it was supposed to deliver growth from which everyone would benefit in a process that was called trickle down. And the data is now in. It's not a 1-year experiment, it's a 40-year, 45-year experiment. And it's an experiment that's been tried in many, many countries. And everywhere, growth has slowed. And what growth has occurred, the benefits of that growth, the fruits of that growth, have gone to a very small group at the top. And the majority of people have not done particularly well.
Yeah, I think one thing is your book is entitled, I even have a copy here, so I'll pull out, I don't know if it shows up, Progressive Capitalism. And I think you're very careful to note that the problem isn't capitalism itself, right? So even in your response, you say it's liberal capitalism. So do you mind explaining what is progressive capitalism, and why is it that capitalism itself isn't the root problem and that there is a solution within capitalism?
So our economy is so complex that no one can run it. You have to have what economists call decentralization. And an important part of decentralization are firms. And firms you can think of as a unit within our society that have a particular mandate, and it's about production, and that's their responsibility. And so having firms that raise capital from bondholders, shareholders, and then give a return, that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. But a market economy, no economy exists in a vacuum. There have to be rules and regulations that guide it, what it can do, what it should do, what its obligations are, what its freedoms are. And the whole debate should be about what those rules and regulations are. And the set of rules and regulations that I use to describe what capitalism ought to be are what I call progressive capitalism, as opposed to neoliberal capitalism. So Milton Friedman's capitalism was one where firms served only one objective, which was maximizing the well-being of the shareholders. And there shouldn't be, and it was all about liberalization, taking away constraints on what firms could do. Milton Friedman, with his wife, wrote a very influential book. I don't think it's read very much anymore, but at the time it was influential. It was called Free to Choose. And I described the book sometimes better as free to exploit. It was a kind of capitalism that said it's the Wild West. If you can get away with it, do it. And even stronger, you should do it. You're obligated to do it. If you can take advantage of your customers, your workers, that increases profits, go ahead and do it. And my view is that that's not the way a good society functions, and that we need regulations to protect the environment. It's very important. If we're in the coming generations, climate change is the quintessential example where we're burning the earth. So we have to have rules to protect the environment. But it's also the case that workers and consumers can't always fend for themselves. They don't have the information. They don't know what's going on. There's a whole legal doctrine of that talks about the least cost accident avoider. It's a lot cheaper for the firms who know what they're doing to make sure that they don't do anything that harms their customers or their workers. So I've argued, very strongly that there needs to be these kinds of rules and regulations. You need rules and regulations to make sure that you have competition. Even the Chicago economists agree that markets only work if there's competition. But they made a mistake. They thought the natural state of the economy is competition. Any of us looking around, Google, Facebook, industry after industry, there's not competition. Nothing like the perfect competition that they envisaged. And it's gotten worse. It's gotten worse. And one of the reasons it's gotten worse is because Chicago economists told the government, don't do anything about competition. And the result of that is we have less competition. So those are just examples of the rules and regulations that we need if our economy is going to perform well.
Yeah, and I think an argument you're saying is that the government has a very important role in setting the rules and regulations. And in fact, in order to promote competition, they need to intervene. And I think as a political economist, right, that intersection between political science and economics, you might argue that the government is not necessarily serving the broader interest of all its people, right? So I think a natural question is, in its current form, perhaps our government is not necessarily serving all its people. And why is that the case right now? Or why has that not been the case in the most recent decades?
Well, if, as I've argued, you need government to set the rules and regulations, then economics can't be separated really from politics. And that means we have to start thinking more about how those rules are set. And so we have to have, you might say, rules for making the rules. And this is where I come very strongly down, strongly for democracy. But we have to think about the rules for making democracies work. And one aspect of that is the power of money in democracy. One of the mistakes that our Supreme Court made, one of the many mistakes, was in a case called Citizens United. It said that government can't restrict the flow of money, corrupt money, into parties. We have even a framework that allows for non-transparent contributions through secret PACs. So political action committees. So the fact is that the way our democracy has been constructed with the influence of money being so great, we have those who are wealthy making rules that advance their own interests. And that was an important point I made one of my earlier books called The Price of Inequality, where there's this vicious circle. If you have too much economic inequality, in one way or another, in almost any political system, it's going to get reflected in the political decisions that's going to lead to rules that lead to more economic inequality. And so you could wind up in two different kinds of equilibrium, a egalitarian system where you have shared, more egalitarian voting rights, and then rules that promote greater equality, or the kind of system that America has been winding up in, which is high levels of political inequality and high levels of economic inequality. Let me just mention one more aspect of what I've emphasized in my discussion of progressive capitalism, which is that it's not just firms and government. I've talked about there being lots of other forms of organizations, civil society, cooperatives, NGOs, and this kind of rich ecology of institutions, I think, is important. Part of our system of checks and balances. Civil society is looking at what government is doing and what firms are doing, giving us information about where they're each failing. There's no perfection in this world, and we have to have constant feedback. And so by having these multiple sources of information, independent media, we are able to get a better information. And if we've circumscribed the magnitude of the centers of power, like the strength of the corporate sector, the corporations, large corporations in the private sector, in the authoritarian rule in the public sector, if we can circumscribe these powers, then we can get a hopefully self-correcting dynamic put in place.
I might argue that universities also play an important role as the intermediary between the firms and the government.
Very much so.
Yeah.
They're part of these. I often I like to point out that the success of the United States is in no small measure due to our universities, and we have great private universities. We have great state universities, but we have no great for-profit universities. When we say private, they're really NGO. They're not for-profit institutions. They're foundations. They're religious institutions. They have many different organizational forms, but emblematic of the for-profit universities is Trump University, which excelled in only one thing: figuring out how to take advantage of those students who wanted to get ahead. It excelled in fleecing the students. But that's what our private universities too often have done. And so, the not-for-profit universities and the state universities are really the foundation of America's strength, I believe.
I want to return to a thread that you touched on that I think is also really interesting. So inequality, the link between globalization and inequality, I think conversations around that have also changed quite dramatically in recent decades. I think my sense is that previously there used to be this assumption that there was a tension, that if we want to promote economic growth, that must mean that we allow the rich to be wealthier. But I think you might feel differently, and I would love to hear how you think about how those conversations have changed over time.
I would say the most dramatic change in those conversations has occurred actually within the last few years. Back again, beginning of the globalization, back to Reagan 45 years ago, the conversation was globalization was going to allow us to take advantage of comparative advantage, specialization. We were all going to be richer, and we would all grow faster. And as I said before, it didn't happen. There was an argument that we were all striving to make borders matter less, maybe to erase them completely. And then the other very big moment was when the Berlin Wall fell, the end of the Cold War, and people like Francis Fukuyama wrote a very influential book where they talked about the end of history. It was, we were all going to be converging to be liberal democracies and free market economies. And globalization was going to do all that. Well, when I was chief economist of the World Bank, I began to see a very different view. I should say, even earlier, I had done some theoretical work that put to question some of these doctrines. So I had written a theoretical paper showing that if you had free trade, but imperfect risk markets, rather than free trade leading everybody to be better off, free trade could lead to everybody being worse off. And then I pointed out that, well, even in the best of circumstances, free trade was supposed to enable everybody to be better off, except it could be better off, but they didn't say they would be better off. And my teacher, Paul Samuelson, had pointed out that in the absence of government redistribution, workers in advanced countries would be worse off. And then when you started looking at what was at the data, you started seeing what was going on. And then there were some very influential papers in economics, a series of papers called the China Shock, that looked very carefully at what happened after China entered the WTO, and there was a surge of trade from China. Very, very well done studies that showed that in those communities most affected by the surge of exports from China, wages were lower, unemployment was higher, and property values were lower. And what that said is the hypotheses that had underlie the advocates of free trade and unfettered globalization were wrong, that markets didn't work quite so well. One of the things I pointed out in my book, Globalization and Discontents, was that in fact, free trade wasn't free trade. It was managed trade. So what the textbooks talked about free trade, when you actually started looking at them, the nitty gritty, and you started looking at them, as I wound up having to do, they were really managed trade agreements, managed for corporate interest. And I'll tell a little story. I was once asked by the president of one of the Latin American countries whether he should sign a free trade agreement with the United States. And I happen to know that he, by profession, before he became the president, had been a doctor. So I asked him, as a doctor, did you sign the Hippocratic oath? And I don't know if you know, all doctors have to sign, say an oath, give an oath that they will do no harm. So he said, yes, I have signed that. I said, well, then you have no choice. You cannot sign that trade agreement, because signing that trade agreement would do harm to large fractions of your population. Go back to the United States and tell them, you will sign a free trade agreement, but it has to be a real free trade agreement where the United States gets rid of all its subsidies to agriculture, all its other subsidies, and see if they'll accept that. Of course, we all knew the answer to that. Of course they won't. And these a free trade agreement would be 3 pages long. I get rid of my tariffs, you get rid of yours. I get rid of my subsidies, you get rid of yours. But if you look at them, the most recent trade agreements, so-called free trade, were like 6,000 pages long. Nobody knows what's stuffed in them. So no, the big change is that beginning with Trump, the United States, which had been the strongest advocate, has now become going on the other side, and it's become bipartisan. The CHIPS Act, which I think was a good act, was an explicit subsidy to the chips manufacturers, and no discussion about how that undermined or was inconsistent with the WTO. So I was just having a meeting today with some people senior in Germany, and they're very upset. But the reality is that we're living in a new world where all these doctrines of globalization are being questioned.
Well, and I think my sense is that, in the 90s, it was globalization is the future, it will benefit everyone. And currently we're living in an age where there's a big backlash against globalization and free trade. But I'm almost wondering if it's like, I think the phrase is we're trying to lock the stable after the horse has bolted, because we are in an interconnected world. And I think I've actually even heard you speak on this, that, COVID has really shown us how interconnected we are. So I think I'm curious on your thoughts. Is the solution to build up barriers and stop free trade, or is it to manage it differently?
Well, clearly, the issue is we have to manage it differently. And that was, again, one of my main themes of globalization and discontents. The fact is, it's not only the pandemic, but it's also climate change. We share one Earth, and we have to cooperate. If any one major country continues to pollute, whether it's China or the United States, we're all doomed. So the fact is that we have to cooperate. But the question is, how do we cooperate in a world where we don't have the shared values that Francis Fukuyama hoped we would have in terms of all being liberal democracies and market economies? It's very clear that a very large number of countries have wound up with authoritarian leaders. Actually, right now, a majority of people live under authoritarianism. And, it's not just China and Russia. There are threats to democracies in many other countries. Occasionally, we have a victory on the other side. Brazil looked like it was slipping, and Lula's election victory says that you can get out of that authoritarian trap almost magically. But so we celebrate that. But it is a real world. So the question is, how in this world where we have these very different values can we cooperate, but at the same time make it very clear that we're competing for the hearts and minds of those, say, in the third world, that we are committed to advocacy for human rights. We do believe in democracy. We're not going to compromise on that. But the fact that we have different political, economic, and social system still means that it doesn't mean we still have to learn how to cooperate. And that is going to be the hardest challenge, I think, in managing globalization. It means some of the simplistic rules that we had when it was thought we were all going to be something called a free market economy, where we said no subsidies. Those are going to have to be reformulated. We're giving subsidies, Europe is giving subsidies, China's giving subsidies, so that no subsidies is just it was never true. Every country did it in a either open or hidden way, but there was a sort of a rhetoric against it, except when it was for your special interest. But we had a rhetoric, and we had an ideology that seemed to provide a framework for when it was allowed and when it was not. But we don't have that anymore. So we're in a world where we're going to have to negotiate. And quite frankly, at this point, and it's something people are discussing over, leaders and over again, we're not sure how we're going to formulate a framework that will guide us in this managing globalization, in this era of cooperation and intense competition.
Yeah. Two things. One, I just want to remind folks that in about a couple minutes, I'm going to start transition to Q&A. So I have a couple questions, but I want to encourage more, since I'll start to switch over to that in a couple minutes. But I also want to turn back to the US, because we're talking about international cooperation. As we were talking earlier, even within the United States, where we have a democracy and these shared values, we've seen that there's this elite capture where our government isn't always working on behalf of its people. And especially in a university environment, I am always with younger generations who want to do something. And I think that's always exciting. And I think when we talk about progressive capitalism, we're gonna need large systemic change, right? We need to trust our government to correctly set up the rules and act in the interest of its people, but we need to make systemic changes so that it's working on behalf of all of its people and not being controlled by the straw, the firms and the top 1%. And so what I would love is to hear what you think that we as individuals can be doing to ensure that our government can make that transition and work for all its people.
Well, let me go back to what I said earlier. Critical in this whole process are the rules, and the rules by which we make the rules. And that comes back to our democracy. And so to me, probably the most important thing is engagement in our political process. The unfortunate thing is that even though young people have the most at stake, in the sense that, I don't have that many years. If things don't work out, I'm out of here. But younger people, if they're 20, they hopefully have 70 more years or 80 more years of life in our country. So they have a lot at stake. And yet the evidence is they don't vote. They don't, I know they have lots of other things to do to occupy them, but this is really important, because the rules that, how they vote will determine who is running the country. That will determine the rules. Whether women have reproductive rights, whether the corporations will get off without paying their fair share of taxes, whether rich people at the very top pay lower tax rates, which is the case, than those down below. It's outrageous that this happens, but even Warren Buffett said it was outrageous that he should pay a lower tax rate than his secretary. Can you believe that? So if you need to have political engagement to make sure that we change the rules, and the most important rules are the rules of political engagement. So in several states in the United States, there's active attempts at voter suppression. That should be an anathema. I mean, in democracy, that we're trying to suppress the right to vote, making it more difficult. I don't think many Americans realized we are probably the only so-called democracy where voting occurs on a working day rather than on a Sunday. Or why? Because we don't want workers to vote. We want to make it difficult for them. We have a system that discriminates against people who work, who have no choice about their hours. And why we allow that to continue is a mystery to me. Now, many states, the more democratic states, have responded and say, okay, we'll have mail-in ballots, we'll have the voting thing open for 3 weeks, early voting. So they've come to terms with the basic flaw in our electoral process. But many states are actively engaged in voter suppression and making it more difficult for you to register to vote and so forth. So to me, that's the most important. But what I said earlier, I also think is critical. I said that any system with a high level of wealth inequality and income inequality, that's going to translate into political inequality. So you need voter engagement to make sure that we change that kind of inequality, because doing that will actually have an effect in turn on our political system. So it's a big agenda, but the most important thing I just want to emphasize is activism, political activism, and at the very least, voting, but going beyond that, trying to engage in changing our society. Now, one more thing. I emphasized earlier that our society consists of a rich ecology of institutions and the importance of NGOs, civil society. In every one of these institutions, whether it's government, the private sector, or this NGO, civil society, there are things that individuals can do that make a difference. Many of you probably won't be a CEO in the next couple of years. It'll take a while to get to there. But when you get to that position of a CEO, which hopefully many of you will get to, you have a lot of social responsibility. It's not just maximizing shareholder value. We talked about that earlier. I have been engaged in conversations with a number of CEOs over many years, and I was so pleased. Just a few years ago, we had another meeting with this particular CEO who I met with, and he said, since the last time we met, I've discovered that I have not been paying half my workers a livable wage. I've been hinting at that very, very long time. And he said, when I discovered that, I raised the wage of all my low-paid workers. So that was a real example of a CEO taking responsibility and saying, how can I make a better world? But that's true. In every job you have, there is a way about how you treat other people, how you help the corporation, the company, the NGO, the group you're working with move towards a more equal society. And when we talk about equal, it's equality in every aspect of how you treat other people.
Yeah. So, okay with you, I'm going to turn to a couple of the questions. We started to get quite a few questions in the chat. I'm going to combine two, because I think very often when we talk about progressive capitalism, the question of China and socialism comes up. And so we have two questions related to China. So first, do we think that the United States could benefit from adopting some of the methods that have been used to reduce poverty in China? And I think the second related question is, do we think that progressive capitalism is different from socialism, like in China? How are they different, and what are the strengths and the weaknesses?
So let me take the second question first. First of all, socialism, as it was traditionally conceived, focused on the public ownership of the means of production. Nobody seriously believes that you can run a complex economy with everything being, quote, owned by the government. That's why I talked about capitalism, but what I'm really talking about decentralized decision-making. So the idea of that kind of idea of socialism just doesn't make any sense in the 21st century. It never makes sense, actually, if anybody fully understood the complexity of decision making. But it really, to fully understand that, one had to make progress in economics, doing the work in information economics was actually essential to understand what it means to run a complex system. And in the 19th century, we didn't have that understanding. Now we do. And that's why that notion of socialism really is antiquated. And that's why I've been advocating this notion of what I call progressive capitalism. The fact that China has made enormous progress in reducing poverty by various estimates, between 700 and 800 million people have moved out of poverty. Well, what China did in many ways was not that different from what we did at some critical points when we were reducing poverty. There was no, magic formula. One of the things that we did in the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt is we provided electricity to rural farmers, poor farmers. We provided roads. We helped even provide water. And going back even further in time, when the US was basically an agricultural economy, China has been basically an agricultural economy up until maybe 25 years ago. The US government created the state universities, the agricultural and mining institutions. But with that, they created the agricultural extension services. So our state universities did research on the key industry of the time, which was farming. And they did research that produced more productive farming. How do you do it better? What was the right seed? What was the right fertilizer? It was all government that improved productivity. Not all, the private sector had a role, but it was a critical role the government had. But then they went even further. They have what we called agricultural extension services. And they brought the insights of their research to the individual farmer, to every farmer around the country. This was an amazing feat. And you might say, much of what China did was to imitate what we did in the 19th century. And they did it on a bigger scale because they have more people. And they had much further to go because they were much further behind. But we've done these things and we've done them very well. And one of the challenges, I think, is how to take these ideas and adapt them to the 21st century economy. So I've said, for instance, the 21st century economy is a service sector economy. We ought to have more research on how to increase productivity in the service sector economy, and then have extension services to bring that knowledge to all the small businesses and all the NGOs who are engaged in the service sector economy.
Thank you. Another question is, a large percentage of Gen Z view capitalism, even heavily regulated capitalism, as wrong. What would you say to that group on why progressive capitalism is the better alternative to neoliberal capitalism, as opposed to an entirely different economic system?
So neoliberalism has failed. So I can argue very easily why progressive capitalism has better prospects than neoliberalism. It's a failure. And there are several countries that have adopted variants of or aspects of what I call progressive capitalism, mostly in Scandinavia, but New Zealand, others. And their standards of living, the well-being of their citizens is higher. So it has worked. So I feel fairly confident that we've done enough experiments on enough of the pieces of what I've described as going into progressive capitalism that I can, this is not just abstract theory. It's actually based on lots of evidence of things that have worked. Well, some people say the other extreme is, just abandon capitalism altogether and have government run everything. And this comes back to the point that I said before. You can't have any single person body running a complex 21st century economy. So you have to decentralize. And what I've described is a variety of mechanisms for organizing this decentralized system. That's why I call it a rich ecology. The balance in different countries could well differ. I don't have a strong view. In some countries that I've dealt with, cooperatives play a much more important role than they do in the United States. There are some really important cooperatives in the United States, and people seem not to realize it. The most successful financial institutions in bringing credit to ordinary individuals, and the only part of a financial system that did not engage in exploitation, were our financial cooperatives, which are called credit unions. And they did well through the 2008 crisis, and after the crisis, they continued to lend. So that's an important set of cooperatives. And there are other many examples of cooperatives. I think there is more of a role for cooperatives, at least in many societies. And I think the mindset of cooperation is actually a good mindset to cultivate. There's an amazingly successful cooperative in Spain, the Mondragon, which I visited a couple of times, established by a Catholic priest, now having more than 1 million people working with it. annex a whole range of activities, very, very successful.
So I think there's a couple of questions, so I think it'd be helpful. So you're thinking of, so New Zealand's an interesting example of progressive capitalism, but you didn't mention, did you mention Norway or what we think of Nordic countries?
I said Scandinavia. So
Okay,
I
perfect.
had Norway, Iceland,
Perfect.
Finland,
So
Sweden.
perfect. So these are the examples of where you would say this has been a very successful model that has benefited all people. Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, another question is someone who is a policy director actually of an NGO, Citizens for Global Solutions. And they're asking a question about why the strength of labor unions have declined so dramatically in recent decades in the United States, as well as why the federal government arms like the NLRB and the Labor Department haven't been able to preserve and advance labor muscle.
Well, I think we've been through, the labor union movement has been through a very difficult time. We have, in that period of neoliberalism, we had labor legislation that was very adverse to unions. We had Supreme Court rulings that were very adverse to unions. We had rulings at the NLRB that were adverse to unions. So going back to what I said before, the rules that govern society, the rules, regulations are really important. And over the 40-year period of neoliberalism, the rules changed in ways that were very adverse to labor unions. Now, that came on top of 2 or 3 changes in the structure of our economy. One of them was globalization. The reason globalization was so important was that the way we structure globalization, especially with investment agreements amplifying the effects of trade agreements, what companies could say, if you don't lower your wages, we're going to move out of the United States and you're going to lose your job. Unions couldn't protect people against that. You know, unions could protect your job if the job was there, but if the company said, I'm going to move my job to China, you didn't have any power. So the unions lost a lot of their bargaining power as a result of this threat of globalization. And the second thing that happened was the change in the structure of our economy in ways that made organizing more difficult, and the unions have now responded. But an example is manufacturing is a sector where you have big plants and you can organize workers more easily. As you move to service sector, the size of the typical establishment gets smaller and smaller. And so manufacturing now has about 9% of employment. It used to be 4 times that number. And so that by itself would have made for a decline in unionization. So these are at least some of the forces that have undermined unions. I think unions are important, not only at the level of the bargaining of the firm, but also as a civil society group advocating for workers. If you don't have somebody advocating for workers, the Business Roundtable and all the Chamber of Commerce, I'll tell you, they're there in Washington advocating for big business and for business. And in our democracy, if you have these very loud voices with a lot of money trying to shape the rules of the economy for business against workers, against the environment, we know what's going to happen. So to me, unions are a very important part of this ecology of institutions. And there have been some good decisions of NLRB. We've gotten a better NLRB since President Biden got elected. And if we maintained that kind of understanding of the importance of workers in our society for a longer period of time, I think we can get legislation and regulations that will bring back unions to a stronger role in our politics, in our society, in our economy.
I say this knowing that we also are in the midst of the UC system. Graduate student unions are in the middle of just started their strike. So I think I'm going to end on, I think, a question that hopefully can end on with a little bit of perspective. So one thing I think, especially in recent times, our understanding of the economy and these forces really seem to have dramatically changed after severe recessions or severe economic events. So the Great Depression, the 1980s, 2008 financial crisis, and now COVID. So do you have any perspectives or sense of how COVID might change mainstream economics or macroeconomics?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think one of the ways that COVID-19 is changing mainstream macro, and I'm glad you asked about macroeconomics, is that it's a shock to our economy. Unemployment went way up. We've never seen anything like it. But it's a micro shock. One sector, the service sector, was hit very badly. Another sector, like academia, we all went on Zoom like we are right now. So it affected differentially different parts of the economy. As we've come out of the COVID-19, we're experiencing this episode of inflation like we haven't seen for a very long time. It's micro. It's auto companies not being able to get chips, resulting in the increase in the price of automobiles. It's ranks in some places going up and other places not going down. It's certain aspects of labor shortages, some places, because employers have exploited their workers. It's oil, food shortages. You can't understand these without understanding microeconomics. And we're seeing the exercise of market power. One of the amazing things is the increase in margins. We've had problems like a shortage of baby formula, the kind of thing that you would expect to see in the Soviet Union, but not in America, that you would have empty shelves on baby formula. Why? Well, half the production was in the hands of one company. Is that a competitive market with one company dominating in that way? Obviously not. So macroeconomists really are at sea. And unfortunately, some of them don't understand that. And they continue to opine using their old models, which aren't describing at all what is going on. You cannot understand this using your old macroeconomic tools. You have to look beneath the surface. This is a microeconomic event of enormous magnitude. So I've always argued that macroeconomics is just the sum of a lot of sectors, but sometimes what is going on is a change in the structure of the economy, from manufacturing to service, from agriculture to manufacturing. These are the big macroeconomic events, and all the big macroeconomic events have a microeconomics underneath them, and you can't ignore that. So hopefully COVID-19 will teach this very important lesson to macroeconomics. I'm not sure. 2008, I thought they would learn their lesson, and It didn't change the economics profession as much as I would have liked. It did have an impact, but less than I would have liked. Maybe 2008 combined with what's been happening in the dialogue on globalization, on inequality, and then finally COVID-19 will provide the context in which economists rethink some of their models, and particularly those in macroeconomics.
I think we are slowly learning or slowly updating. Well, I know we said we go till 4, so I want to say thank you so much for your time. I think we really enjoyed your conversation. I can tell you that I was not able to get to the questions, so everyone was very excited, and I think we could have kept talking to you for hours. So thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz.
I really enjoyed this.
I really enjoyed this. And also I'll say to those of you that I could not answer the questions, Professor Stiglitz is prolific, and also his books are very, very easy to read and very fun. So I would highly recommend them, but also thank you so much.
Good. Thank you.